Hey, welcome. It is so good to have you joining us today. My name is Andrew Groza and I am the State Director for Alphacrucis University College in Victoria and Tasmania. For those of you who perhaps are not familiar with Alphacrucis, we are a Christian education provider and our mission is to equip Christian leaders to change the world. And that's why we are putting on events like this. We want to help equip you to do the things that God has called you to do. You can find out a little bit more about us by clicking on the links that will be posted in the chat shortly. Talking about the chat, there are two ways that you can interact with us today. We have a Q&A function, and closer to the end of the conversation, we're going to open it up for some live Q&A with our special guest. We've already had some great questions already come through the registration process, but if there's a question that comes up as you're listening to us, then you can put it in the Q&A function just to make sure that it doesn't get lost in the chat stream. And the other way is the chat, of course. And so if you want to engage with some of the material that we've been talking about, if you want to highlight a particularly meaningful point, or you just want to engage with some people that you know that are actually on the chat, why don't you just do that? We have people joining us from right across the world. I saw through the registration process that we have got people from Vietnam, from Japan and other parts of Asia. We've got people from Africa. We've got people from Colombia, New Zealand, just across the ditch, New Zealand, our great friends, and of course, the great country of Australia. And so why don't you open up the chat and let us know. We were having some technical difficulties, so we'll see if it's up and running. But if you can, open up the chat and let us know where you are from, because that would be an absolute delight to see those come through. Well, I'm so excited about this conversation that we're going to have today. We live in a distracted age. It is difficult in our day to find space to focus on that which is most important. Most of us will often battle overpacked schedules, incessant notifications on our digital devices or the systems that we routinely work with. And I don't know about you, but I'm sometimes my own worst enemy when it comes to distraction. I often liken these days to resembling being in a crowd of people where everybody is kind of tugging at your clothes and trying to distract you and point you to their priorities and their agendas. Now, in the midst of the maelstrom of that type of activity and the clutter, our capacity to stay focused is diminished. So what can we do about that? How can we address the reality of that situation in such a way that it allows us the space we need to break free from the clutter that constantly clamours for our attention and live with healthier habits? What can we do about that? Well, our special guest, Daniel Sih, is so well primed to talk to this situation. I first came across Daniel when a colleague of mine in Tasmania emailed me to let me know that that one of our alumni, I do use that word pretty loosely, he studied at Tabor, Tasmania, and we merged with Tabor, Tasmania, but that he had just won the 2021 Australian Business Book of the Year in the personal development category. The same book was also finalist for the best technology book and the best cover design. Shameless product placement right there. That is this book, Space Maker: How to Unplug, Unwind, and Think Clearly in the Digital Age. And we just found out that it's also been shortlisted for the best Australian Christian book of the year, which is super exciting. We'll find out whether or not it takes out first place in the next couple of weeks. Honestly, it is an outstanding book. Now, Daniel, the author, he co-founded a productivity consulting group and has coached many high-level leaders and executives on increasing focus and productivity and just general life well-being. In the past, Daniel was a physiotherapist, and I find it quite ironic that whereas in his physiotherapy days, he was trying to manipulate muscle so that you can get more out of it or to get it to a healthier state, he is now helping people do that with time and with focus. Now, in addition to all of that, Daniel has been a pastor and is passionate about the church, passionate about discipleship, and he's a Tasmanian to boot. And he has chickens who, in his own words, eat a lot of grain and lay too few eggs. Daniel, thank you so much for joining us, mate.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Thanks for the introduction. Really great.
Well, appreciate that, and sorry about the chickens and the egg situation. So I'm curious. Talk to us about the current world that we live in and why you think distraction is just so prevalent today.
Yeah, no, thanks. Look, I was having a coffee just yesterday with a friend who had been traveling around Australia for about 3 months, maybe 4. And I asked him, how did he find the trip? And he said, oh, look, there were parts of it that were really difficult, traveling with, 4 kids, navigating the Nullarbor, et cetera, et cetera. But he said the one thing that was really amazing is I only had to focus on one difficult thing at a time, basically getting my family from here to here, and I don't know, not being eaten by crocodiles or bitten by snakes. And he said that was so different. And I didn't realize how many balls I juggle day by day when I'm just in ordinary life. And I think that is our reality nowadays, that everyone I meet, no matter what field you're in, no matter where you are in the world, people are saying they're busy and time poor and always stretched for time. People tell me that they're distracted, that they running to standstill, going from one thing to the next. They're trying to manage their attention and their kids and their work pressures and their Netflix episodes and their social media feed and get their inbox under control. There are so many different balls that are just in our court. And I think that causes a whole lot of challenge to thriving in this new age. Of course, a lot of that is impacted by our digital habits.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you tell me about a time when it really hit home for you personally?
Yeah. Look, it was probably a few moments. I was reading a book. That makes me a geek, right? But I was reading a book, a productivity book by a guy called Tom Chatfield. This is about 7-8 years ago. And I've got a quote, actually. He said that time away from digital media is not only our default state, it is something we can't experience without explicitly aiming to do so. So what he's saying is that we're now in a situation where being online and distracted and always on the go is normal, and being slow and still and rested and unplugged is something we actually have to intentionally build into our life as a habit. And it was like a wake-up call, because I looked at my life and I'm like, that's so true. I used to experience life and then I would head to the computer and maybe do some Hotmail. That's how old I am. And yet, sorry for those who still use Hotmail. But then now I realize, actually, I have to be really intentional to get off of my email and to live in a kind of an unplugged type of way. And I think that really changes the game in terms of how we shape our humanity, our discipleship, our work habits, and everything, that we can almost assume that we'll be online more than offline. And therefore, we need to be really thoughtful about what it might look like to make space to think and rest and just breathe and focus on what matters most.
It's a very thoughtful response. Let me play the devil's advocate. Why is that even important? So why do you think it's important for us to understand that and to maybe try redress that situation?
Yeah, because there's some great things about tech. I mean, my book and my teaching is not anti-tech at all. I mean, I love technology. We're talking right now from the other side of the Bass Strait in real time, which is pretty amazing. So there are some amazing things. So why do we need to have space? Look, Elon Musk said a few years ago that we are all cyborgs now. And pretty much we should get over it. And what he meant is we are all half machines already, so let's not worry about AI, because you and I are mediated by our devices. And that's a great thing in many ways. So I have the ability to access information all around the world in a way that was completely impossible when I was a child. I can communicate with you and others around the world in real time, my confession, I'm wearing Ugg boots right now on a webinar. I could never go to work in my Ugg boots before the internet was available. There are some things that we can do because of the power we have in our pockets, because of the digital power and influence we have that we couldn't have done before. So all that stuff's good. But where Elon Musk, I think, we need to push back against accepting that we're cyborgs, like a cyborg is like Darth Vader or RoboCop or like the Terminator. They're really bad at relationships. I mean, you don't go to Darth Vader for like kind of relationship counseling, right? And I don't think these kind of crazy characters are great at spirituality or internal reflection or rest. I don't think the Terminator rested very well. Like what I'm saying, I'm being tongue in cheek, of course, but being human is really important. And actually, there's something about being online all the time. If we actually become cyborgs, we lose something of our humanity. We lose the ability to examine the inner life, to listen to God's voice, his small whisper. We lose the ability to interact with loved ones without being mediated by someone else's ideas and someone else's interacted media. We lose our ability to just sit and be still and enjoy our own thoughts, to know ourselves, to see the environment around us, to be present, and to experience the breadth and depth of life, like walking in in bush, smelling the trees after, I don't know, a rainy day, or paying attention at the soccer as our kids actually, muddle through and kick a soccer ball around. Like we lose humanity if we become like cyborgs, and that's what we need to reclaim.
So again, just some profound thoughts, which I find deeply challenging, because I've always modeled my parenthood on Darth Vader. So maybe he's not a good parental father figure. Some great thoughts there. So it leads to this next point. You make this great statement in your book where you said that the iPhone redefined our experience of being human. Could you unpack that a little bit more for us?
Yeah, sure. And it's probably similar to what I've said. I mean, it basically has changed our experience of life. Jean Twenge has done some amazing research. So she's an American generational researcher from the US, and she's tracked generational data for years and years and years, all the way back to the 1930s, finding out what 17-year-olds were like in like 1950, 1960, 1970, etc. So she's comparing people at the same age over different generations. And basically, she found that it was almost like an entire generation changed overnight around, I think, 2012, 2011. And when they did a meta-analysis of all the longitudinal data, they found out that the only thing that matched was that the iPhone came out. When the iPhone hit 50% saturation in the US market, an entire generation changed overnight. Their habits changed, their practices changed, their beliefs changed. And it wasn't all bad. I mean, they were a safer generation because they didn't drive cars as early as I did, for example. They didn't date as much because they didn't spend very much time actually interacting with real humans. They stopped going to parties. They stopped interacting in all the ways that we used to. And some of that is a good thing. But where the negative side is, where I think where it has changed our humanity, is the mental health stats of Gen Z and beyond. Is just terrible in terms of anxiety, depression, suicide, and self-harm. Those stats have gotten a lot worse, and they just continue to get worse the more and more we use social media and the more and more we use screens as the everyday part of our life. And so, yeah, changing our humanity. I mean, in some ways, of course, it hasn't. But when we relate to people online instead of in person, where we offset our memory to devices rather than memorizing things ourselves, where we find our identity in our screens and in our social media feeds, it actually really does impact at us at a heart level, which kind of does shift what humanity looks like.
Brilliant thoughts. This leads me to think about something else that you mentioned in your book. And on one level, technology is like neutral. It doesn't necessarily have a mind, at least at this stage, right? It's how we interact with it. But on one level, it's not, because underlying it, there is some ideas that led to its creation, and some of those might shift the way that we interact. So what might be some of the ideas that kind of underlie our use of devices or something like social media, and what should we kind of be aware of?
Yeah, look, let me talk about the ideas embedded in technology. But just before I do, it's probably worth framing the way I put that in the book as well, because I've got a chapter about technology in the book. My understanding of tech is that you can tell someone to shift their tech habits, like, I don't know, unplug the phone at the end of the day and don't let it stop you sleeping. Those habits are really simple in terms of understanding them, but they're actually really hard to do because we have a story, a paradigm, a set of ideas and mindsets that actually lead us to have particular behaviors. So unless we reshift our beliefs around technology, unless we rethink our paradigm and our relationship with the online world, using Christian wording, unless we have a metanoia, a repentance experience where we change our mind around what technology is and what it means to us, it will be very hard then to make space in the online world and to shift our habits in a sustained way. So that's the caveat. And one of the ideas that I mentioned in the book to shift our paradigm is to change our understanding of the ideas embedded into technology themselves, which was your question. So I hope that's okay.
Right.
So there is, I think of Winston Churchill, and he once said that we shape our buildings and then they forever shape us. And that was actually in response to the bombing, the Blitzkrieg in London, and they bombed the House of Commons, and they were trying to work out, do we rebuild it in a semicircular structure, or do we keep it rectangular? And his argument was actually the rectangular nature of the building itself creates the two-party system where you face each other off and you debate each other. And that is the hallmark of our British parliamentary system. Therefore, the building shapes the behavior, and we need to keep the building the same. So they rebuilt it like it was built originally. But I think the idea is really important that our environment absolutely shapes our worldview, and therefore our worldview shapes our practices. When it comes to technology, we are also shaped by an environment. It's more like an ecosystem that surrounds everything we do. And there are deeply embedded ideas within the technologies that we use. And those ideas, as we practice the internet, they invariably shape our heart, our head, and our habits. And we need to know this as disciples of Jesus, because most of us are actually being discipled by the ideas in our technologies without even knowing it. And it's not about the content itself. The medium is the message. That's McLuhan, if you want to go and look up some kind of media theory research. And so an example, the key idea in the iPhone is that it's a multitasking device. I mean, this is what Steve Jobs said when he released it. It is an iPod. It's a phone. It's an internet-enabling device. It's the iPhone. It does everything. You can look at the weather. You can check your email. You can have the social media feed. It's all running in the background at the same time, which is why the device is so incredible. It allows you to do all this stuff simultaneously. The problem is we cannot multitask at a brain level. The research is very, very clear. You can flip very quickly from one attention-rich task to another. So you flip through constantly, but you can't do a mathematical equation and check the weather at the same time. It simply is impossible. And yet, when we use a multitasking device with the idea of multitasking embedded within it, we end up distracted, because we end up going from this to this to this to this, and we lose our attention span. We can't focus as much as we used to. It changes the dynamic of how we relate to people. We get bored quickly. We can't even commit to turning up to somewhere at the same time and the same place, because we might want to keep our options open because of the multitasking change in our mindset and heart and habit. So we need to be aware. That's all. We need to be aware that technology has ideas, and that those ideas will shape us over time. And if we don't see them consciously, then we will unconsciously be discipled by our devices. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. And I'm so glad you went there. It makes me think of some of James K.A. Smith's work, particularly from his book, We Are What We Love, and the nature of the practices that we engage with shape us or misshape us in particular ways. And so we need to be aware of some of those things. I just think and so, again, which leads me to the thought which you just articulated so well, that really our engagement with our devices are an issue of discipleship and formation. Because if we are engaging like if we are unintentionally or unaware of what we're doing, engaging with our devices, and they are shaping us, we need to bring it to our awareness so that we can be formed and shaped by maybe, another story, the kingdom of God, etc. I'm just thrilled that you went there. I was listening to Andy Crouch recently, who was talking about the fact that we walk around with a device that is 100% attentive to us. Like, it is always listening. All you have to do is say those magic words, "Hey, SIRI." I'm not doing it now because it's going to interrupt this feed, and it will, pop open. It's always listening to you, and I think that can potentially shape us in the way that we expect life to kind of play out. Any thoughts on that, perhaps?
Oh, look, I would agree with you on that. I mean, the original one was called an iPhone, so it is pretty much individualized to the hyper extent. The entire world revolves around you. I mean, what you've described is that. So again, when we participate in the liturgy of technology, it shapes us with the ideas of individualism, of consumerism, of multitasking, and we are discipled by this. I mean, we have to take this seriously. I really believe that the church has missed the mark on technology. I think technology is probably the most important thing we need to talk about in our churches, because if we want to make disciples, which I believe is the game of like Christian formation, of meeting as a church, to create apprentices of Jesus whose heart and habits and mindset are shaped and oriented around the person of Christ, where we move from unbelief to belief, each day is a step-by-step process by repenting and believing. If formation in Christ is the main game of our faith and of what we're meant to be doing, well, then the major competitor is technology, because it changes the game. I would almost go so far. I was speaking to a minister the other day, an Anglican minister, and they said, I've come to the conclusion that if I give a child a phone when they're in primary school, they won't be Christians when they're adults. Like, it's that serious, because you are pretty much embedding their worldview very early in a way that isn't in line necessarily. Now, I'm not saying it's all bad. That is not my message at all. That's more about age appropriateness. But I might just give one example, if that's all right.
Go for it.
I was at a church service. And this beautiful man came up, an elderly man, and it was a Churches of Christ church. So they have communion every week. And he gave this, I suppose, a Churches of Christ, the pre-communion discussion. And he said, I've been coming to this church for 50 years, which is amazing in itself. And he said, I've realized that if I have had communion, let's say even 40, 50 times a year at this church, I've had, more than 2,500 communions with this community. Imagine the formation that has had on who I am as a person. Imagine how that sacrament has transformed my spirituality with 2,000 communions. And I agree with him, okay? But I couldn't help but be distracted, because right next to me was a 7 or 8 year old boy who was with his mum. She was paying attention, but he had an iPad and he was playing Angry Birds, where you kind of pull back the bird and blow up pigs, right? And I was watching and I just couldn't help, because I counted how many times he swiped Angry Birds in like 3 minutes. And I did the maths in my head. And I'm like, okay, so you're swiping Angry Birds 2,000 times a day. And then this person's having 2,000 communions in his life. And how can we say that one tool is not going to form us as well as the other? I'm not saying that the Holy Spirit isn't involved and that Angry Birds is the same as a sacrament, but we need to have our eyes open about what is really forming us, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally does. I think that is quite profound and quite challenging for us, particularly if we are really engaged with our devices and our technology, because that what you've just shared can be quite confronting. Here's a question around that. What might be some of the symptoms that we are actually addicted to our devices?
Yeah, well, that's an easy one. Turn off your device for a day this week and don't look at it for 24 hours. If that is not difficult to do, I mean, logistically, it might require some communication before you do it. But, if you can do that and it doesn't really stress you out too much, well, then you're probably fine. but most people have some level of stress. So, and really, I mean, that's the Ignatius way, find the thing that you think your idolatry is around, and then fast from it, and then find out what it does to your heart. And on a more specific note, I would say you're probably addicted to your technologies if you reach for your phone first thing in the morning and last thing at night. If whenever you have a pause on the toilet, at the bus stop, whenever you're at the train station or in the line at the supermarket, you habitually reach for your phone and just pull it out just because that's what you do, then you're probably heading towards digital overuse. If you're thinking about technology and things that are in the online world when you're with your kids or with friends, and actually you know that you should be present with them, and yet mentally you're actually the neuroplastic pathways in your brain, which have been conditioned as a liturgy, are now seeking to get that dopamine hit and stimulation outside of it. And I don't say this to judge you, because I'm addicted. I mean, we're all basically in digital overuse, which is part of the premise of my book, particularly post-COVID. We're almost all in digital overuse. It doesn't matter whether you're a grandmother or whether you're a middle-aged person or whether you're a teenager addicted to Instagram. And therefore, we need to be having these conversations. What does it look like to love technology, use it well, value it, but at the same time, not let it become an idol that controls our lives and shapes our spirituality?
That is brilliant. So in preparation for this interview and in reading your book, I decided that, for the last 4 weeks, I have been taking a sort of a digital Sabbath on the Sunday, not using my phone at all, or trying not to. I tell you what, it was hard. I had to come up with other ways to keep notes, or, just simple things like, oh, I want to listen to that song, or I want to Google that term. Like, what is that about? And needing to come up with strategies to go, oh, well, I need to change that and see what I can do. Try to overcome the anxiety of, have I missed an important text message that I need to attend to? Like, all of that stuff. So, it was quite interesting for me. You talked about digital overuse, and you address it really well in your book. Can you just talk about the tension between productivity and effectiveness and focus and technology, and then digital overuse?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, because it is a productivity book and that's my field of expertise. So my premise, it's more than a premise. The research suggests that unplugging and disconnecting from digital overuse is actually a way to be productive, as well as healthy, as well as happy. And so there's this paradox. It's not a simple equation. We're certainly not saying tech is bad and no tech is good. That's not what I'm saying at all. So if you imagine a graph, and I think people are all watching. So if you imagine a graph looking at technology use and productivity and technology use. Here we are. Imagine an upside down U. Okay. So essentially, if you get technology and start using technology, your productivity will go up. Okay. So you imagine someone who has no technology and they suddenly get an iPad and an iPhone and they start using apps and get tech savvy. They will definitely be more productive in almost every area of life, every field of work. And we all experience that, which is why we use technologies all the time. But the more technology endlessly doesn't lead to endless productivity. There comes a point where you plateau, where more technology doesn't actually make you more productive, but you kind of reach this saturation point, or a point where you get limited returns with more tech. But then what happens is, if you continue using technology constantly, where it starts to take over your life, like you said, where you can't have times where you just stop because your brain's suddenly thinking, what about this music, and what about this thing, and how can I look up this, and you're just going here and there like a multitasking machine. Well, then you actually end up sliding down the right-hand side of the inverted curve, and you end up in digital overuse, which makes you less productive, less focused, less happy, less healthy. And my premise is, post-COVID, all of us almost in culture have slid to the right-hand side of the curve. And so the greatest productivity gains for many of us will actually not be by using more technology better. It'll be by unplugging in an intentional way and learning to recalibrate the human aspects of thinking deeply, sleeping deeply, connecting with real people, thinking your own thoughts rather than other people's thoughts, learning to single task again rather than multitask. And so the secret is what I call making pace and keeping making space and keeping pace. So keeping pace is the left-hand side of the curve, where we need to use tech to get productive, and we're all going to have to keep working on those skills. And I teach people those skills, but at the same time, most of us need to make space. So to unplug, to return to the productive middle, out of digital overuse. And that is a fairly new thing we all need to start working on.
So can you talk to us about making space? What are some of the principles behind that?
Yeah, making space is just recognizing that there is tremendous value in, particularly, I would say, deep thought. So the ability to think very clearly without digital stimulation. That includes contemplation, silence and solitude, listening to the Spirit of God. For those who are followers of Jesus, it's about being quiet and still in your mind. So deep thought. I'd say making space is about deep rest. So the ability to actually rest in a way that is mental and physically renewing, which we are losing as a society, and we're exhausted and anxious and depressed as a result. And also deep relationships. So really interacting with people in our lives who matter on a regular basis, eating real meals with real people in real places with real mess. That is being lost. And those three things are some of the benefits of why we would make space. See, space in itself isn't the goal. Space for a richer, more vibrant human existence, that's necessary.
That's brilliant. So what might be ways that we can increase our focus and our capacity to maintain attention on the most important things?
Yeah, so I think there's keeping pace. So the habits of using technology to be focused, and then there's making space, the habits of not using technology to be focused. So my book focuses on the right-hand side of the curve. So practices like having a digital-free meal, starting and ending the day without technology, having a digital-free Sabbath, exercising occasionally so you can think your own thoughts and not other people's thoughts. So creating patterns and spaces in your life which are intentionally digitally free in order to then recapture thought, rest, and relationship. But at the same time, you also can use habits on the left-hand side of the curve to increase your productivity. And I teach that as well, like Email Ninja. How do you get your inbox to zero? If your inbox is out of control and you're an office worker and you're getting 50, 100, 200 emails a day, well, then if you don't have the skills to manage high volume email, you won't have the space to do the other stuff. So therefore, you need to have rhythms where you're single tasking your way through email, not constantly checking every notification. Those kind of things. I would say pick a to-do list. Know what your goals are each year or each 6 months. Break them down into projects and tasks, which I teach in terms of online to-do lists. Make sure you know what your 5 big rocks, your 5 most important tasks across work and life are every week. Write them down, tick them off, keep focused on the things that will help you achieve your longer term goals, and then schedule them in your calendar each week to make sure that you're actually focusing on the things that matter most. So you need skills on both sides of that upside down curve.
Mm. That's brilliant. And if I'm understanding it correctly, the capacity to create space will allow you and increase your capacity to stay focused on some of those things. Can you, we'll get to some of the practices in a moment, and then we're almost at the time where we'll have some Q&A. But can you just share some advice for people who are now working from home? So the last 2 years have made quite a significant shift in the way that people are engaging, and many of us are working from home. Any specific advice around staying focused in that space?
Yes, I'd probably just say that the challenges that I wrote in my book are amplified by working from home. So the benefits are incredible. I mean, I'm now a home worker. I hardly leave my house unless I have meetings. Most of my clients are now overseas, which is great, except for the time zones. So technology is amazing and working from home is fabulous. In fact, I think it's like the majority of people now want to continue working in a hybrid way. So some time with real people in the office, but a lot of flexibility from home. So it is working for us. However, deep rest, deep thought, deep relationships are all at risk, and they impact our health, our happiness, and our productivity. So an example of deep thought, okay, one of the ways when I'm training people in productivity, I'm training work teams, I run a course called Priority Samurai, how to set priorities and keep them. And one of the things that people have often said is that they use the commute, so the train or the bus or the driving in the car or even the walk or ride to work, they use that without knowing it to actually just think about their day. What do they want to achieve? What might they plan for the day before they open up their inbox? But now when we're working from home, the commute is from like the bedroom to, I don't know, to the room next door where you open up your laptop and then you're at work. And a lot of people have realized that they're just diving into longer hours at the front end and back end of the day because there's no boundaries or rhythm to their day. So they love that they're not in traffic jams, but they haven't used that time in order to recapture what has been lost. And so I would encourage people to go for a walk for half an hour instead of a drive for half an hour. Walk the dog or think and pray, reflect on what you're going to do for the day, allow your brain to wake up and to create so that you enter your day with a real sense of intentionality and focus rather than just diving in and letting email determine the texture of every moment. There are many different things we need to consider through hybrid working, but they almost all relate to deep rest, deep thought, and deep relationship.
Wow. Some great advice. Thank you for that. You talk about deep rest. You had this line in the book that just gripped me. Rest can be harder to achieve than work. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, well, I always assumed that, I'm a physiotherapist to start with, and then a project manager and a pastor. And in all those fields, I spent a lot of time reading and studying and learning how to work. Like, what are the skills to preach? What are the skills to, treat a patient, et cetera, et cetera. But I never really kind of went on that same journey of learning how to rest because I assumed that you have work and then when you're not working, you're resting. And I don't think that's true at all anymore, particularly if you're a knowledge worker. So a knowledge worker isn't like a manual laborer. Their work isn't necessarily what they do with their bodies. Their work is what happens in their mind, and it's almost always mediated through a screen. So my work is to type, to communicate like this online. It's to look at the internet and to manipulate data and information. What I found is I was having my so-called days off on the weekend, and I was typing and swiping and communicating with people online and using the internet. It might have been Netflix or games or social media, but the brain can't tell the difference between Outlook and Instagram. And interestingly, the brain uses up, as an organ, it uses up 20 to 25% of the body's energy. And interactive media, like I just described, is highly intensive on the brain. And so this is why we end up with brain fog, with anxiety, with constant stress, because if we're working using technologies and then our rest is exactly the same, you're still online for rest, well, then you're actually not resting from your work. And so I went on a journey and I've written about this extensively in the book, What a Digital Sabbath Is. It's not just about turning off your tech. It's about starting to ask three very important questions. What is work for me? So how do I really define what work is? What is rest for me? How do I actually work out what is life-giving and restful for my heart, my soul, my relationships? What are those activities that truly represent rest at a spiritual and practical level? And then how do I habituate the rest things and disconnect from the work things on my day off, my Sabbath? And that takes you on a very different trajectory than just having a leisure day or a day off to taxi kids from here to there while I'm scanning my screen and still putting myself into the mental processes of work. So yeah, very, very simply put, we have to work out how to rest. And that will take a process and a journey when people are always connected and rest and tech are intertwined.
Yeah, that's brilliant. All right, so let's just talk about a couple of practices, and you mentioned them just then, digital free Sabbath and a couple of others. Why don't you give us one or two practices that people can put in place right now?
Yeah, look, let's start. The low-hanging fruit is probably the easiest to do quickly, and they would be daily practices of unplugging as opposed to the annual or the weekly. The Sabbath is definitely the hardest practice, but it's the most biblical and most life-giving. But the daily practices are pretty simple. I love, if you have a family or if you live with other people, the digital-free meal is a game changer. I mean, the research in that is tremendous. Charles Duhigg, who's a habit author, calls it a keystone habit like exercise, because if you exercise, you end up with better health, more energy, you end up better at work, you have better relationships. It unlocks all these other habits. Okay. Eating a meal with those you love is a keystone habit. It does the same. So when 12-year-old girls ate regularly in a research study with their families, without technology, so without the TV or without screens, they ended up with young kids have higher literacy and numeracy scores when they do that. But kids at 12 end up, when they're 17, with less teen pregnancies, less marijuana addiction, less likely to smoke. They have better outcomes, so better scores for entering college. And then as they become adults, they have better mental health outcomes. They have more wealth. They have better jobs. It's just exceptional, the benefits of this one simple habit. And yet we are losing it in our culture. We are absolutely losing the ability to eat without devices and to connect as a family around a table and just to communicate. So that's one thing you can do. A digital free meal, half an hour, 45 minutes a day, no tech, make it a sacrosanct meal, and talk to each other. And it doesn't even matter what you eat. Like you can feed the kids $2 pizza from Woolies, and the outcomes from a research perspective are the same as if you cooked organic broccolini with chia seeds. It doesn't matter. It's about talking and being with people you love face to face, which is how we are wired as humans.
That's great. Although I would prefer 2-minute noodles, the Indonesian variety. That'd be great. Brilliant. Well, I've got one more question that I want to ask you, but I'll probably ask it at the end. We'll move into a couple of the questions that have come through the registration processes. They've really been outstanding. But if you are engaging with us right now and you've got a question that you want to ask Daniel, why don't you open up the Q&A function and just pop in your question there. So Here's a question that came through that I just thought was very insightful. How do you remain available in a pastoral care position without feeling the burden of constant need, i.e., when is it appropriate to turn the phone off or to have a day off?
And look, I'm assuming I'm speaking probably to pastors with that question. Is that so in terms of ministry?
Yep.
Yeah. So again, I've been a pastor for 10 years. Look, what I would say is you can get locked into a profession and then get a bit of myopia, or you can lose the ability to see outside of your own profession. That's happened to me when I was a physiotherapist and then a pastor and then a productivity consultant and now a business owner. But I now coach and consult people all around the world, and pastoring is unique, but it's not that unique. Politicians and people involved in the media, so radio announcers, they say they can't turn off their phone because they're always at the beck and call of the media. And if they don't check it, they can end up on the front of the news the next day with a bad story. Doctors and consultants are on call because someone might have an aneurysm and you can't kind of suddenly stop. Teachers are the same. They feel like they can't put down their phones because their students might need to contact them. I actually think it's more common now for people to say they don't know how to put down the phone because they don't have the ability, because they have to be on call. So pastors are not unique in this sense. And I think it's worth having that to begin with. The second thing is you just have to set boundaries. I say it to any profession. You set boundaries, communicate those boundaries, and keep them. Honestly, responding to a brain aneurysm is more urgent than responding to a pastoral prayer visit. So let's put it in context. And so I actually think that we need to just put boundaries down. So for me, it would be things like, I just won't answer the phone to people at nighttime unless I can scan the phone and see who it is. But if it's the same person who always has a crisis, I stop answering the phone. If it's someone who has a crisis once, well, then that's a bit different. On Sabbath, my wife and I made a decision. We have a lot of people who would knock on our door and need prayer or support, or who have mental health issues, people who come to us a bit more regularly rather than kind of once or twice off. And we made a decision to start saying, I'm sorry, this is our family day and we're not available today. come back with your crisis tomorrow. and the world goes on. I mean, set boundaries. And Jesus did. Like, I mean, I haven't thought about this in detail, so maybe I'm theologically wrong, but immediately I think about, birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Like, he was quite happy to say, go bury your father, like, he put boundaries down all the time and said, you either follow it or you don't. And I just think pastors need to lead by putting good boundaries around their lives and expect others to follow. And at the very least, it just stops people being consumers and teaches them that they have to feed themselves, or that others in the community need to step up if you leave gaps. And that's a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really, really good point. Okay, here's another question. How do you stay focused in a paid ministry on the work that's most important when your upline that you're tasked with tasks that are not as important but need to get done quickly? So how can you stay focused when people are giving you work that maybe isn't important but just needs to get done?
Yeah. So in productivity terms, we would call this managing up. How do you actually manage the people up and sideways who are kind of trying to take your time and determine what happens? And look, there is an art to this. It's not just, do this, don't do that. There are times you need to say yes and times you need to say no. I actually think there's a whole suite of productivity tools and practices that high-level leaders need in order to manage up and manage themselves. And I actually think it starts by managing yourself. So some of the things I would recommend, or that I do in those situations, firstly, you need to know what your priorities are. If you open your email each day and you let email shape your priorities, well, then you're already off to a bad start. Alternatively, if you have some clear goals and then you've got a project list where you break those big projects that you want to achieve over, let's say, 6 months to a year, you break those down into very next actions, so projects and then tasks, break them down to bite-sized chunks that you can do in a manageable way and put them in your calendar. Well, then if you only pick 5 big rocks, so 5 most important tasks over the week, if you expected to do it on Monday and Tuesday and then the whole world goes to poo because something happened and you had to respond to what your boss wanted, well, then you still have time to get those 5 things done as long as you create a bit of margin, which is actually another skill. So I think it really does come down to managing yourself. And then if it's something really big that is going to kibosh your whole kind of priority schedule for, more than just a week, well, then it's a conversation. It's saying, this is what my most important project is, and this is what I'm doing towards it and how much time I feel I need in the next 2 weeks. I'm happy to take this on, but what part of this project or what part of my role do you want me to neglect as a result? And you want to push the cost of the yes back to the delegator rather than you owning the cost of the yes, because every yes is a no to a whole lot of other stuff. There are lots of skills, but there's plenty to read up on how to manage up. And that's kind of the field of expertise you need here.
That's some excellent advice. Really, really good. We've had a couple of questions that have come through specifically around the concept of ADHD or ADD. And so, for example, for people with those conditions, keeping focus and away from distractions is significantly more challenging than the average person. So what advice would you give for people in that situation? Any ideas there?
Yeah. So look, I won't give advice because I'm not a mental health expert and I actually don't understand ADHD very well. I'm happy to give some thoughts, which is a bit different than advice. I think it's worth clarifying that. And those thoughts are really based on what I've read from others. So I don't know if it applies to you or not, but I do remember reading Victoria Dunkley's book, which was Reset Your Brain. And it was fascinating. She is a psychotherapist, or no more than that. Anyway, she's a professional in mental health in America, and she was referred like thousands of people with diagnosed mental health disorders like ADHD, bipolar, depression, and psychosis. She mentions particularly in her book, and she started to see a pattern in the behaviors, particularly in the younger people, and how they were linked with online gaming and high social media use. And so she started to experiment, and over a year and a bit, she took 500 people off of medication and gave them a 4-week digital fast. and basically said no interactive technologies, no digital technologies for 4 weeks. There was a graded program, which she outlines in her book, and she got she had a significant reduction of more than 50% of symptoms in 80% of her clients. That is amazing. And her conclusion is that technologies are causing ADHD, or at least ramping up the symptoms of ADHD and making it harder. And the irony is with ADHD, because of, from what my understanding, people often feel that they need to use the technologies to reduce their anxiety and to help them be distracted or to help them manage the symptoms. And yet it seems that the management tool itself is actually ramping up the long-term symptoms. So I don't have advice because I don't know your situation, but there are definitely people who seem to be where their ADHD is ramped up by the technologies that they're using to manage them. And I think that's a conversation we need to start looking at more seriously.
That's great. And at least out of her research, by the sounds of things, being able to dial back your engagement with digital technology or engaging digital the world would be really good.
Can I say one more thing on that, actually?
Yeah, absolutely.
I probably should mention there is a difference between technologies and screen time. So not all technologies are equal. So the more interactive technologies like gaming, like for kids, Minecraft and Fortnite, but for adults, anything where you're really interacting with lots of flashing lights, with intermittent rewards, or something like social media where there's social cues and social rewards like hearts or likes. All of this ramps up the part of the brainstem that actually creates fight or flight and anxiety in people, as opposed to more passive media like Netflix or traditional media like television, where you are sitting back, leaning back rather than leaning forwards. And from a brain perspective, it's less stimulation and therefore less likely to cause risks of the whole kind of nervous system overload. And in that sense, there is a difference. So if you watch 2 hours of, if a child watches 2 hours of television, they won't sleep. But if a child does half an hour of Minecraft, they won't sleep. And so we need to also recognize that not all devices and not all screens are equal. And that's worth considering in the mix when you look at what you use and what you don't use.
That is a great distinction. So thank you for sharing that. Leads into one of the other questions that has come up. So do you recommend, I know this might be pretty subjective, but do you recommend particular time limits with TV, iPads, video games for children? And if so, what are they?
It's not subjective at all. There is mountains of research on this.
Okay.
The national recommendations of Australia and America and the UK and pretty much every peak body for screen time is no screen time whatsoever for 0 to 2 year olds. That's everything, television, everything, because their brains are plastic and it's bad for their brains. Then between 2 and 5 year old, maximum of 1 hour a day of screen time, then from 5 to 17 years old, no more than 2 hours of screen time a day, excluding homework and work-related activities. And the types of screens are also important. So particularly in the younger ages, avoid iPads, avoid the types of interactive screens that ramp up the brainstem, amygdala, and the deep parts of the brain, because it seems that they're linked with more anxiety, more irritability, bad behavior, etc. So when I'm talking young, I'm talking particularly 0 to 5. So the types of technologies matter, and also the distance matters as well. So there is an explosion of myopia or nearsightedness in young kids because they're spending so much time with near screens. So lots of near screens creates nearsightedness in young children. An example in America, they found that in lockdown, when kids started educational online learning, I can't remember the stats. I think it was about a 30% increase in myopia, so nearsightedness, in kids between, I think, 5 and 8 years old. And then the older they got, the less high the percentage of nearsightedness happened because of screen use. So basically, the kids' brains are not developed to use close-up screens and interactive screens. We should be very careful at a young age. I have just written a book on this. It'll be published in November, a very practical guide on how to raise tech-healthy humans, how to raise humans. So that's a very short overview, but there is a lot of very practical advice about how to grade kids into devices at different ages and how to do it in a very practical, research-based way.
Great. Fantastic. Looking forward to that book coming out. Okay. Last question from our audience, which I thought was so good. How do you stop social media sucking you dry when your role requires you to attend to it?
It's a hard question. I remember being, I won't say where, somewhere in Australia, chatting with a bunch of leaders from church. And a lady started to tear up. And she said, look, I know that I think I might be addicted to social media. She said, I'm with my kids and I want to give them my attention. And yet all I can think about is wanting to check my feed because I want to see how many hearts my latest church post had. And her job was to actually run the social media for her church community and the networks of churches that she ran. And so that's a really hard question when it's part of your job. But I was thinking about that and thinking, actually, if I had an alcoholic in my team, someone with a history of alcoholism, then I wouldn't get them to pour the communion. It's actually not appropriate to give someone who's addicted a job where they're put into places of addiction. Does that make sense? Just like we wouldn't put adults who had history of sexual abuse, to look after kids. It's the same thing. So why are we putting people who are addicted and struggling with online technologies into roles where they need it for their ministry work? We need to start looking at this a lot more carefully, I think. Jonathan Haidt, who's a moral psychologist, says that there's almost enough research now to say that we should probably have health warnings on social media for teen girls between 12 and 16 years old. I know it's a different question, but there is a point where we need to recognize that some technologies impact some people in a very significant way. And they're not just playthings, they're very powerful tools that are wonderful and transform our lives, but they need to be used really carefully with the right context. And that's an employer's responsibility to be part of that conversation.
Wow. That's pretty profound. I think some of the principles you've already talked about, like setting limits, and putting the onus back onto the person who's delegating, and being able to have some of those conversations would help in that space. That's really good. All right, we have almost run out of time. Let me ask you one question that I think is just so important. How do you, in this digitally immersed age, this age of distraction, how do you stay focused and attentive to hearing the voice of God?
Good question. I don't think there's any secret that's different than what we've always needed to do. Have a passion and a hunger for Jesus and long to hear his voice. The sheep will hear the voice of the shepherd. That's what Jesus promises. If we want to, if we're willing to not only hear, but then obey. So be like the man whose house is built on the rock in Matthew 6, who doesn't just hear the word, doesn't just debate it and discuss it and have great Bible studies, but who puts it into practice. So I think to hear God's voice, we need to be hungry for hearing it and to be obeying what we hear through the word of God. And, to learn to listen to God's voice, that usually involves spiritual disciplines like reading the scripture every day, having silence and solitude, or journaling, or fasting, or practices where we're intentionally asking God for things, praying and listening to his response, and also doing it in community, being involved in a church community who take listening to God's voice seriously and who help each other discern the dreams and visions and prophetic words and scriptural insights that you have in order to guide our journey towards being more like Jesus, which goes back to being apprentices of Jesus and disciples. So there's no secret. The only secret for us is that none of that will happen with technology in our hands because, that's a bit extreme. That sometimes the technologies stop us from being able to listen to God's word long enough. A classic is when you read the Bible on a phone and then you decide to check out a commentary and then you're suddenly, looking at Mumford & Sons' next album. Like there's something different about technology that distracts us from having those pauses. And I think we need to separate ourselves from technology in order to have the space, in order to hear God's voice, in order to obey and become more like him. So it's just one more step, but the practice is the same.
That is beautiful and deeply convicted. Just this morning, I'm reading the scriptures, pick up my phone to write a couple of thoughts down, and then I find myself on something else. And I'm like, oh, wait, come on, what are you doing? Stay focused, Andrew. This is terrible. I'm just glad that you mentioned Mumford & Son. So I really appreciate you, Daniel, very, very much. We have come to the end of our time together. One of the principles of space making is to set limits. And so I want to make sure that we keep to time. Daniel finishes the practices section of his book each time with a great question: what is the next action? And so I want to throw it out to those of you who have engaged with us today. What is the next action for you that has come out of this conversation? What is it that you are going to do? Can I challenge you to go on the record and tell someone to turn around and say, hey, I've engaged with this. Maybe even share this with them, and then say, this is what I am going to do to help create some space so that I can hear from God, so that I can be more authentically human, so I can be healthier and even more productive as well. So deep thought, deep rest, and deep... the other one.
Relationships.
Relationships. Thank you very much. Just had I need to do create some space just so I can remember that. So Daniel, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate your generosity and just your time to come to us. And thank you to all of you who have created space for you to equip yourselves for what God has got for you. So really value you. Thank you so much. And I pray God's blessing upon you as you enact your next action. God bless.